In this seminar, I'm going to talk about border disputes. I published in 2015 an encyclopedia, which is 1,200 pages, that basically is fairly descriptive. In other words, we list 85 or 90 different cases. They are, I'll show you the list. I have the complete list on the presentation. But basically what we do is we define what border disputes are. And then we have 3 volumes that basically make reference to many different cases to illustrate what the different disputes are. And it goes in quite some depth. And so this is basically the team of people who helped me put together the border dispute. So what's interesting here is that each entry is organized as follows. So you have the summary there. You have a summary and an introduction and then physical and topographical features of the border disputes, then the history, culture and politics, current status and conclusion. And then on top of this, we've got glossary of words, the kind of organizations that are dealing with the disputes or on the land that is disputed. We have also a few academic reference and a list of treaties. So each entry is exactly written that way. And the only difference is how much of the entry in the encyclopedia is set. So it's the same format whether you wrote as an entry author 2,000 or 4,000 words. There are few entries that have up to 8,000 words, so they're very detailed. And the goal that I had was to illustrate this on all of the continents, including the Arctic and the Antarctic. So we have basically a set of disputes that presents this all over the world. And the one thing that I should add is that when we did the complete presentation, like when we did the complete survey of all of the disputes worldwide, so looking at every single dyad, right? So we have a dyad is basically a line between 2 states. So if you look at Canada borders, for instance, you have a super long dyad with the US. Then you have a dyad with Alaska, which is also the US. And then you have a number of dyads that go across the Arctic, but you do have one between Canada and Russia, and then on the other side you have some with Denmark for Greenland and some islands, and France, and then if you look around the circle, you see that you have, a couple of small other dyads. And so if we look at the complete survey of dyads across the world, we have about 300 ballpark, right? Not to go in the details, it varies a little bit because indeed dyads can be contested. We had identified 130 disputes. That doesn't mean that today all of these dyads are territorial, as are disputed, but it means that there are 130 disputes, some of which are territorial, and then some of which are maritime, and that's the whole issue. When we look at territorial plus maritime dyads, then we are about 800 dyads worldwide, a bit more than 800 dyads worldwide. And I would say that, basically 20%, about 20% of the dyads are being disputed. So I'll come to this now and because I have a long section where I basically discuss the different dyads and the different disputes. Now I'm going to theorize this a little bit because I think it's interesting to look at where we come from and where we are going. In other words, what are we studying when we look at border disputes, right? Are we looking at something that is exceptional? In other words, it's an exception because it's a border dispute between 2 states, or is it actually something that we should not think is exceptional, but is something that is basically dealing with the way the world adapts to social and cultural transformation, but also economic transformation. Just to illustrate this briefly, until the 1990s, we had no standard agreement in the UN for water disputes. We had a few cases, but we didn't have the UN Convention for the Law of the Sea in place. And so we didn't have formally established tribunals to deal with this. Obviously, post-1990, there are lots of disputes that appeared just because of this, because now we have the instruments and we have the tribunals and we have the ability to do this. So one of the movements that I think is interesting here, one of the trends that we're looking at, is the idea that, you know, states are established and stay across history, and it's never really been disturbed. Because when we look at this, when we look at the stability of a state, we always assume that they are there forever. But actually, we just emerged since the Second World War out of a period where the number of new states is quite incredible. And it's not just because of de-colonization. And so this is one of the things that I want to discuss, because it shows in a way that there is a demography, a transformation of territory across the world, where states play a big part, but maybe that's not the only one. So that's kind of why I'm talking about theorizing this. One of the first things that I thought was really interesting when studying border disputes, and that's why I used those two citations, is that, first of all traditional societies, our ancestors basically, have always had a way to basically accommodate communities across space, across territory, and we even have words now in political science, but also in geography, to talk about this. The power applied to space is basically called territoriality. And so we have this, and one of the things that I think is really interesting, and that Jared Diamond actually doesn't really discuss here, but I think is really relevant, is this idea that we have the first ever technology appear to divide territory, to divide spaces, politically divide spaces, about 4,000 years ago. So these are the first ever treaties recorded that we know of today, right? It's the Stela of Wiltur, the Sumerian stela that is 3,700 and something years old. But we know that before that, there were already ideas of division of territory. And also one thing that we tend to ignore, but which is very, very important, and that's why I have the note from Norman Davis, is that, you know, these territories are not always that stable. So the average life of I'd say, territorially contained power, or sovereign, you know, contained power is about 48 years. And so it's very interesting to see that actually these territories have a life of themselves. There are empires that we don't discuss in historical books that have existed, that have dominated spaces and territories across the world that are really interesting, but we don't really discuss them because they have no more ancestries today, right? They have happened and then they have disappeared, and they have been replaced since then. So it's really interesting to just take this example that, you know, you can be born to this day into the British Empire, where it basically dominated the whole world. And at the end of your life, which is today, you realize that it's a really small area in the world, and that the rest of the British Empire actually is made up of all these different states. So that's kind of what we're looking at here, because this is the whole transformation of the territory across the world. So one of the starting point of the studies that we've done, but in the Encyclopedia, we have cases that are obviously older than 1945, and I will discuss them. But here, one of the things that I think is interesting is that in the history of states, so since Westphalia, you know, the 1600, basically, the United Nations is the first international organization that has had a mandate to promote cooperation across the different empires and the different kingdoms that formed it. And at the end of the Second World War, one of the things was to promote cooperation, to negotiate and to implement a global policy, which was the policy of decolonization, so that it would be as peaceful as possible. And it's interesting, I think, in itself, because it shows us that the mandate of the UN concerns the creation of about 80 member states. So we started with about 50, and we have 80 that are added, and still it doesn't really calculate properly or compute properly, because today we have 193 members, plus a number of other members that have observatory status. And on top of this, we have about almost 30 members that are, or territories that are recognized by members of the UN, some of which by more than half the members of the UN, like for instance the Palestinian territories, and yet are not fully fledged members because they cannot pass the agreement within the Security Council of the United Nations. So it's interesting to see that, we have this architecture of institutions that organize and in a way control and help state as their members control the evolution of this membership into the international community, but also control this membership and this accession into the international community, but also the fragmentation, what I call here the fragmentation of states, right? It's the idea that certain political communities would basically want to control the space or their ancestral space, and that they can be oppressed quite a bit before the international community steps in to say, okay, enough of this mess, let's create a new state, or let's give you some right towards self-determination, and so on and so forth. So here I'm only looking at, the marginal, but this is kind of the context. And when I say I'm only looking at the marginal, is I'm looking at these cases that are, in a way, either historically or internationally known to be interesting references to disputes between different members of the international community. I don't really look at cases, and in the Encyclopedia we have few cases that are like current ones. We obviously have, the case of all the borders of Israel are obviously are contested, and so it's quite interesting to have, each diet being discussed, because each diet of Israel is actually, potentially an issue for both sides of the state. So we have some cases, but I stayed with the idea that we would really illustrate the different categories. So this table is a table that I made to show that post 1946, when the UN starts with 55 members, we have basically creation of new members. We have new members that appear in the UN, and that it's almost every single year. So you have the list here all the way to, basically 2011, and it's based on UN documents, obviously. And I've only put members that are fully fledged status within the UN, with the latest one, which is obviously South Sudan, so the division of Sudan, South Sudan, that actually has maybe not resolved the issues, because to this day, this is a very difficult division. But just to see that, the idea of decolonization and having a UN mandate to implement a fairly peaceful decolonization has led to many, many new states appearing, but at the same time, it hasn't resolved all of this. And suddenly, if the UN had a mandate to help about 80 states, there are almost as many states that have appeared because of basically self-determination fights, right? And I think the world, I talk about the expression of political clout and self-determination, because these are the words that are used in the literature, but the communities that want this independence in some cases have to be so determined that, violence and some kind of violence appears very regularly. So it's not all of them, but it does happen to be not uncommon, and to this day it's still I guess I'm going to go in the details now a bit more. So we have in the literature we have basically three types of border disputes. So a border dispute, what is it? It's basically when two members of the international community or more cannot agree as to where a boundary line is. And a boundary line is the line on the ground that separates two territories, right, or two spaces. And the categories are quite interesting because they emerge out of different understanding of the boundary line. So the most dramatic one, the territorial dispute, is actually a broader category. Territorial disputes are broadly understood when there is some form of violence between the two sides. And they can threaten at least one of the two members of the international community. It can threaten the existence or the territory. Cases of invasion and occupation of territory, or contested occupation of a territory, and so on and so forth, or occupation of. But it is basically a broader category which is very often confused with also cases of war. Right? Because the number one reason for war, as documented by people who only study instances of war, is actually territorial disputes. So today when we look at the history of war, which is a complete different data set from the history of territorial disputes, we realize that out of basically 150 or 850 cases of war since 1800, about 700 of those cases of war have been justified by a territorial dispute, which is a threat to a given power, right? So it's quite interesting to realize this, because the two literatures obviously would need to be worked on a bit more. So I'll go in the details, but I just want to highlight this. The positional dispute is very different. The history of the positional dispute comes from, in a way, the existence of treaties, or the inexistence of treaties, but very often it is based in the existence of treaties that are not clear. And the reason is that we didn't always have the technology to basically mark the ground in such a way that we knew exactly where the boundary line is. And I think this is actually a really interesting category. The other one, the territorial dispute, is fascinating because it's quite diverse, quite violent, and quite, has a huge human implication, which, human rights organizations, for instance, would find outrageous, and we have many reasons to think so. But the positional dispute is really rooted in the fact that, technologically speaking, we just don't know where the boundary line is. We have a sense of where it is. So just to illustrate this a bit more before I go in the detail, it very often emerges that post-colonial states have positional dispute issues because the treaties that are early treaties in the colonization walked on the boundary line without having a very specific, detailed position of the line. Today, when we mark a line, we can do 1/10 of a millimeter. We actually can go even more to 1/100th of a millimeter because we have GPS, and we can be extremely specific about the position of the boundary line. But in the past, many treaties actually walk through the countryside and make references to things that you see when you walk the boundary line, such as trees, building, rivers, deltas, and so on and so forth. And so many positional disputes, for instance, have to do with the fact that a river moves in its riverbed, and that the movement of the river and the talweg, which is the lowest point in the river, may even move across seasons and never repeat itself from one year to the next. Or that you have islands in deltas that have, depending on the current, appear or disappear, and yet in the treaties they were actually identified as the marker for the boundary line, and so on and so forth. Or that you have, the peak of a mountain as described as the highest point on ice, move one side or the other because the ice is melting, and that the side where the water falls is where the boundary line is. So the more the water, the more the seam of the mountain moves, the more the boundary line moves. So you have lots of places where describing the boundary line and the position is something that is really approximate in the treaty. So how do you resolve this? And then we have functional disputes that are more about how you exploit. So if you agree to where the boundary line, the functional dispute is more like a dysfunctional view or a lack of agreement between two states. For instance, how do you man your border? How do you enforce certain policy all the way to the boundary line? And the fact that we know today that lots of state policies actually straddle over a boundary line is obviously a problem, because people don't agree basically how to mark the boundary line. It's not that the boundary line has just to be marked, even though that's the way lots of states look at it, especially states that have less sophisticated bureaucracies and administration. But the whole idea of the functional dispute becomes extremely clear, for instance, when we want to exploit wealth that is located in the border region. So for instance, if you know exactly where your boundary line is, and you under the boundary line you have a coal field, or you have oil, or you have gas, or you have water reserve, or all kind of wealth, precious minerals, or even if you want to have access at sea, for instance, to certain fisheries and certain other resources, exploiting these wealth can be a whole issue, right? And so, for instance, between Sudan and South Sudan, one of the big issues is where the pipeline go across Sudan. But the oil is in South Sudan. And so the exploitation of these resources, and it's in the border region as well. It's not just south of the border, but it's in the border region. So it makes it very, very complex. So functional disputes, in a way, are much less, in a way, engaging. They may be more technical, but they also sometimes are quite difficult to resolve. And you'll see I theorize this a bit more once I've discussed the different examples.
Sorry, can I just ask a question about positional disputes?
About which one?
Positional?
Positional, yes.
So you were saying that...
I'm going to discuss them in detail,
okay, sorry.
right? I'm going in detail now. So the territorial disputes are about, basically land of earth. And they are quite complex because they are disputes that encompass all kind of issues that are neither territorial nor functional, in a way. So it's the broader category, and it's also the most violent category. And they have been justified, as I said, by war and pogroms and genocides in history. Very often when you look at a list of territorial disputes that are unresolved, in a way, it's because they have a history of war. And they can be territorial disputes that are very peaceful. And you'll see in the list that I'm going to show you that there are territorial disputes between states today, between Canada and the US, for instance, that have, in a way, almost no importance today, but they're still listed as territorial disputes because they were part of disputes in the history of the relation between the two different states, right? So that's kind of one of the categories. So here I have two slides with all of the territorial disputes that we included, or at least most of them, that we included across in the Encyclopedia of Border Disputes. And you can see that some of them are really contemporary from, for instance, the Pashtun territory between Afghanistan and Pakistan, or, the current position of the Israeli-Egypt boundary line. The territory is still not actually, it's very peaceful, obviously, but it still is. Denmark, Norway, Eastern Greenland, right, which is still disputed, and so on. And there is a past, obviously. All of them are listed there as territorial disputes because they have a past of war. China, Russia, for instance, which is quite interesting, but you also have other ones that I can put here. For instance, you have Japan, Russia, the Northern Territories, which is post-Second World War, the Kuril Kimi-Ara Islands, right, which is quite well known. Because it's called in Canada. It's well known maybe because it's called Northern Territories, like we have Northern Territories here, but it's actually 4 little islands that are at the end of in the Kuril Islands there, and so on and so forth. So we have long list. We have some territorial disputes that are actually quite recent, like the Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and then the Morocco, Spain, and so on and so forth, that illustrate actually, I would say that are stand-in case or classical cases of territorial disputes that are quite difficult. Now I'm going to talk to you just a little bit more about one of them to make the case a little bit clearer, and I've chosen to do the Bolivia, Chile, Peru that was basically written by Laetitia Rouvière, which is and Laetitia Perrier-Bursley, because they both did their PhD in this area, and they worked afterwards with us in Borders and Globalization a couple of years ago, and I think this is quite an interesting case. So why is it interesting? Is because it's unresolved. It's rooted in the War of the Pacific, so it's a dispute that has existed since the 1870s. And has gone on and has basically not been resolved by any decisions. In 2005, there were decisions, and one of the things that we realize when we look at the detail as to why it's so difficult to resolve such a dispute, for instance, is that the different states have different ways of presenting their case and have difficulties with accepting the different legal and historic traditions of the other cases, of the other states. So Bolivia, Chile, and Peru can't basically agree on what history tells them, can't really agree on the legal traditions that they should bring to the court to basically then agree to court recommendations. And it's quite interesting to see this in the entry. It's, there is, I'll just cite one thing, but there is a hard line by Chile, which is basically rooted in the legalist treaty-based tradition, whereas Bolivia has a different perspective on this, which is based on the history of the users of the territory and so on and so forth. So we see that very often, the whole issue is that there are different traditions and different understandings even of the history and the origin of the treaties or the texts, whatever texts they are in these cases. A current dispute which is not in the Encyclopedia, but we could lead to some real tension, is the 9-dash line in the South China Sea, where there was a decision a couple of years ago made by the International Court of Justice, and where we see actually that China is really flexing its muscles and imposing basically a new boundary line in the south of China. And I don't know how this will evolve, but it's not there. It's still, in a way, it's still viewed as a positional dispute because the text can't be agreed upon. But when I go into how the court basically deals with this dispute, you'll see the different categories that are used and so on and so forth. I'll detail this a bit more. But you see that different legal traditions and different types of elements that are presented to the courts to the court is something that is quite interesting, because this is very often where the states can agree. So, if you have, for instance, a very strong nationalist agenda rooted in political culture of a given state, then it's very, very hard, obviously. And if you disagree with certain treaties because they were, let's say, signed during the colonial period, it's very, very difficult to kind of disengage from this, because you have tensions between a legal tradition and a political tradition, or an economic tradition and view of exploitation of the land, which is one of the things I'm going to discuss later for a positional dispute. And so you can see that the position of the states and the role of the courts there are very, very difficult. That's why very often territorial disputes are very hard to resolve. It's because of the complexity and the history of violence behind them. Now, if we go a bit more in the detail of the positional dispute, we have, as I say, very often positional disputes because of the exact location of the boundary line. And very often it is rooted in technical difficulties. The whole idea is that you could not just use now that we have GPSs and that we can be extremely precise when we make maps, we can use maps as a reference to a treaty. But when the maps were approximate, when the maps were made reference, when the maps were used as illustration and not as reference, right? Post 1919, post the Versailles Convention and the Treaty of Paris, one of the things that has happened is that maps have become more specific and much more precise, but they were never as precise as they can be today. And so, for instance, a good example of the positional border is the whole green line between Israel and the Palestinian territories, where the green line is actually a green line on a map that separates the two territories. But the thickness of the line on the map is as large as a highway which today exists on the Israeli Palestine delineation. So it's a 4-lane highway, right? So this is kind of the issue that we have, because as soon as you would have similar issues about where the boundary line is, and that the map of reference is an old map in a way, it is not a very specific, or it's not specific enough to not have a dispute about it, especially if the ground is very wealthy. You'll see when I look back at the cases and I illustrate this more in detail. Do you want to ask your question now, Nicole?
No, keep going.
Okay. So another thing that is really interesting is that, as I said in the introduction, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea is something that is fairly recent. And so a lot of maritime disputes are positional disputes because either the treaties are not really there, or because we have treaties but we didn't have the exact position of where the boundaries are, and so on and so forth. But these can be technically resolved. And that's kind of the good news here, is that very often you do have treaties. And so the states can very often work out, basically, they don't disagree about the general position of the boundary line. They just disagree about within which range or given border region is the boundary line located exactly. And that's one of the things that has happened. So we have, in the Encyclopedia, we have all kind of disputes that are located. And I think it's kind of interesting to see between Canada and the US, we have the Beaufort Sea, we have the Alaska boundary, we have this Dixon Entrance, we have the Portland Canal, and so on and so forth. Victor Conrad did a number of those. And they all have to do with, old maps, and also because the states have lost interest actually in the disputes, because they have found other ways to basically resolve these things. And at the exact location of the boundary line, very often it's because it's at sea, or it's in between at sea and land, and because it's, either a canal or because it's a estuary or whatever. The point is, states can go beyond this, but in some instances, it's particularly complicated. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the German-Netherlands M-Dollard estuary, which was written by Martin van der Velde. It's my favorite one, not only because it's Ems-Dollard, which I think is a really interesting name, but it's an estuary which has been disputed between both constituency, we can call them. It's a dispute that is 480 years old. And neither sides, when they were, kingdoms or even strong cities on the Netherlands side, could ever find a way to agree to it. It is a dispute that has to do with an estuary, and what it means is that the talweg of the estuary of the Dollarweg, of the Dollar River, the Ems-Dollar River, goes into something which is like a triangle open to the sea. And the idea is this: depending of where the talweg is, the lowest part in the river, the projection at sea tells you where the boundary line is. The problem with this very specific case is that the tidal wave changes with the speed of the water in the river every season, every year, and never repeats itself. So the range of movement of the water current at sea varies in the closest area of the land by about 20 miles over the 3 miles boundary. So if you have the boundary, that follow the coastline 3 miles out, the angle of the tidal wave will vary like, in a way, a fan almost by 20 miles. And the implication for fisheries out at sea, 14 miles, 20 miles, 100 miles, is a huge territory, obviously, outside. And it varies every year. And a few years ago, the whole dispute was kind of, in a way, became again very important because on the German side, they decided that there was a location in this disputed area at sea where the winds were extremely good to actually put a wind farm. And Germany was very keen on building the wind farm. Today the wind farm exists. How did they resolve this positional dispute? By basically sharing the electricity production. So they can't agree on where the boundary line is because they will never be able to basically agree that one or the other should basically own the land at sea. But one option out in a way that can exist is that the two sides can agree on using, and it's a nice way to resolve this. Another dispute which is kind of interesting is just below, but we see it reappear again below. So you have the Great Britain-Iceland Cod War, and then you have the Greenland, Iceland, Norway, Jan Mayen Island. But the one I want to talk to you about is the Cod War between Great Britain and Iceland. Until the 1970s, even though Iceland was an independent state, post-colonialization, right, with Denmark being the old colon of Iceland, Icelanders had the right to fish within 3 miles of their of the land, and the standard is obviously much more, right? The idea, the standard is that you should be able to fish way more, and so there was a conflict about cod being fished by Great Britain. There was a kind of a modus vivendi between Denmark and Great Britain, and Great Britain had always fished around Iceland and in this area. And although it could have become really violent, what the Icelanders did was they would basically prevent British vessels from fishing in the areas where they were used to fish. So they would have all of these small Icelandic vessels, because at the time Icelandic vessels were still very small, basically surround the British, and it created what is called the Cod War. And then there was an agreement that imposed onto Britain basically the international standards from the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. Which is quite interesting, is that the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea and the development of the standards at the time, the legal standards, were still in discussion. They started in the mid-1960s and were not implemented before the 1990s. But in the meantime, these discussions pre-existed, and so were kind of the foundation for the resolution of the Icelandic Britain Cod War. But we can see here, right, it's the past colonized rule that still is imposed onto what we could call actually a non-colonized, but it was colonized, right? Iceland was actually colonized and was really, was really exploited by Denmark for a number of centuries. And that is one of the remains. I think it's an interesting case because it shows that all rules still persist and are still imposed onto formerly colonized countries for the determination of their own boundaries. And so if powerful states are not willing to relinquish, then how do you go about this? If Iceland had decided to go at war, obviously it would not be here, it would be in the volume 1, because and it would probably not have been resolved either. But the point that I'm trying to make here is simply that it has to do with the position of the boundary, and at that time between maritime boundary, the 3-mile rule or the 14 or the 100-mile rule were not yet well established, and so that's one of the reasons we have. We have another one that I wanted to discuss with you a bit briefly, is the Brazilian Uruguayan one. And
sorry, Emmanuel, there's an intervention from online. Do you want to just hear?
Yeah.
It's from Rod, talking about the UN Convention, and he says, it's interesting that UNCLOS did not create disputes, but created problems of interpretation of rules for resolving disputes, and then had to create tribunals for resolution of those arguments about the interpretation.
Yeah, no, I actually, Rod, I don't think it's interesting. I think it's, I think it's very interesting, but I don't think it's surprising. I think that is why that is why we have rule systems, right? We basically frame certain issues in a certain way, and then we need to have the instruments to actually implement that framing. And so when the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea started standardizing, and it did this in recognition to former rules, because the first discussions that we had on disputes, if you look at, for instance, the right, for instance, of passage across a canal, for a water canal, and you have even warships that have the right of passage as long as they are peaceful and they declare, what country they're sailing under, their flag basically, and make it clear. And so all these rights pre-existed, but it was all based on jurisprudence. It was not a standardized system. So what the UN Clause does is it standardizes all of this, and it creates a system of rules that then obviously has to be implemented. That's why the tribunals appear, and that's why the resolution is possible. So there was a huge backlog, I would say, until the 1990s of unresolved and unexpressed issues at sea that have been resolved since then, are still being resolved, although I think that they've been probably better addressed at sea than they are on territory today, and we can discuss this a bit more later. But I think at least the UN Clause has been very successful in implementing international standards across the way. There are issues with the UN Clause, obviously, when we look at states that have refused to sign the convention, that are still refusing to sign the convention. But globally, we can say that it's a very successful process, both because it was well rooted in legal history, but also because it's standardized for everybody, a system that is well understood and serves the states. I mean, one of the things that you discover when you look at the implication of the UN Clause rules is that certain states territory has doubled the United States in one of them, right? Because when you look, or even France, for instance, France with all its islands, you could say that, France, when you look at the map of the world and you look at the space that is basically French today, it's not the small France, it's that actually the very large at-sea areas, which are under French sovereignty today, thanks to those rules. And I take, two fairly powerful maritime states today, but generally throughout the world, I think the idea that you could use state territory as the basis to then expand sovereignty over sea and then put in place clean standards have been very, very successful. And it was very much needed because the world was expanding at sea, right? Trade was one thing, but the exploitation of the seas also, I think, expanded really tremendously. And also, we had already GPS, right? From the 1950s, we knew the technology, and so we could finally map properly all the seas, right? And we could probably basically expand all of this quite well using maps as the new standard reference to where the boundary line is far away from coast, which is something that technologically was much more difficult before the GPS. And the GPS, I think, only appears in 1954. as a new technology, and is implemented and standardized only in the 1960s and 70s. Obviously, today we all have one on our phone, but at the time it was, not that clear. So it's that new technology, and I think it's important to see that, these legal innovations have also been influenced by this technology. At least for positional disputes, I think the old technology, which I call the rule of law and the ability to make some maps, helps a little bit, but certainly the rule of law plus the GPS obviously makes huge, in a way, inroads into resolving the disputes, especially when you have suddenly, this global rule, in a way, or standardization of the rules for all the members of the international community, which is kind of a really modern text of law when we compare to, the case-per-case study, for instance, of territorial disputes. I think that's kind of an interesting case. Now, the other example I wanted to discuss very briefly is Brazil-Uruguay, which is it's a little bit actually like the Elms-Dollard case, but it's an area where you have a disagreement between Brazil and Uruguay, and the treaties are not very specific. And what has happened is that part of the land north of Uruguay has been, in a way, sold privately to landowners from Brazil. And it's quite interesting in itself because it's a privatization of land and the sale of land to economic actors that are on the other side of the border. So you have today a borderland that is really complex suddenly, because of these difficulties. And it's made even more complex because there is a lagoon right there. So it's kind of interesting to look at this because obviously the lagoon is in the middle, and even though you have an old treaty, and from 1750, the occupation and we could say the presence of either Brazilian bureaucracy or Uruguayan bureaucracy has never been really well enforced. And so this is why you have positional disputes, is because the two states have all treaties that are not very precise, and then the private sector comes in and you've got a big mess made up here. This is kind of, the post-colonial example for me. And so today, how do you resolve this? Well, the only way to resolve this is collaboration, which is sometimes very difficult. So this is kind of the, another example that shows you how these things can happen and how they have happened in the past because of old empires not being so concerned and having treaties that are not very specific, and then having private exploitation of the land that is not very, very specific. And then you don't really know in the borderland exactly where the boundary line is. And if there are disputes, then, well, you have to sit down and decide which county is going to go where and who owns what, and basically do it piecemeal and find ways to negotiate this. And so these disputes take forever to be resolved because it's both land and in this case, land and water, and can't really be resolved. Yet in this case, it concerns a fairly large swath of land, obviously, because it's across the whole boundary line. So I think it's like 8 million kilometers of land. So it's quite a bit of land, but we're in countries that have very large amounts of land. Now, I want to go to functional disputes, and then I'll look at specific cases. Functional disputes very often have to do with how we exploit the boundary land or the borderland itself, right? And it's very interesting because it can be about manning the border. It can be basically about agreeing or not with the kind of border policies that you have to impose the boundary line. And it can also be about the exploitation of that boundary line. So if you have a borderland that is resource rich, as I was saying, you have something that is like a functional dispute, but it can also be, it can also be broached on to something that has to do with not just the functional exploitation of the boundary itself, but the wealth which is just below. It has to do with policies, and it has to do with misunderstanding of policies or misalignment of policies. So it's the case of a state that has the resources, for instance, to extract oil from the ground versus the other side that doesn't have the resources to extract oil from the ground. And the functional dispute, for instance, would have to do with, is this the same oil field or not, and so on and so forth. So these are kind of interesting cases because these disputes really have to do with sharing resources and agreeing on how we can share those resources. Now we have some examples here that are quite interesting, and I talk about a number of those are quite neat to look at. We have the Russian, for instance, the Northern Sea route. You have Norway, the Svalbard archipelago, for instance, that I think are quite interesting. You have the Northern Passage, which you know of probably a little bit because it's in the media on a regular basis in between Canada and the US, ignoring obviously Denmark and Russia, even though they have some say in it, and so on and so forth. And so here, what is really interesting is to see that very often we know where the boundary line is. There are some, so in the case of the Northern Passage, for instance, is the whole dispute, and I think it's an interesting case for per se, it's putting pressure on Canada to have the infrastructures so that other countries have the rights basically to use the passage. And I'll give you an example recently is the Chinese have developed code books or books that allow people allow boats to go in the summer. You have a number of cases here that basically describe these difficulties and these tensions between these different countries. The Svalbard case is the one that I want to discuss a bit more, and it's an example of the way the states very often resolve these cases. So in the Svalbard case, I think it's really interesting because Norway is a fairly small country. It's a resource-rich country. The Svalbard archipelago is really located in the borderland between Russia and Norway. It is a resource-rich area, both in fishing, but also for other reasons, including deep sea resources. I guess the solution, the fact is that because it's made of an archipelago and that you have many different islands, you can't really use just the idea that you have a boundary line to divide the islands and decide that some part is Russian and some part is from Norway. But the way it was resolved, and that pleased the Russians, one can say that, is that when the Norway decided that they would create their economic zone and basically implement their right in that region, a disputed region, they basically decided that they would engage with Russia to share or to develop common infrastructures and share them. And very often, functional border disputes are resolved with this ability that certain states will develop to share the resources, because otherwise it becomes very difficult. One of the weakness of the UN CLO is that it is based on a vision of the world which is territorial, right? It's the idea that you extend sovereign rights at sea. And so it basically assumes that you can draw a line. But it doesn't always work that way. So if you create an economic zone, for instance, over fisheries, and that the fish move, how do you basically make sure that the rights, the territorial rights follow? Or do you close the rights because it goes over the boundary line? This is kind of the, and when you are basically exploiting, let's say, gas or oil, you have in a way the similar issue, right? Because the ability to map out, although we have the technology to go quite far today, remains something that is a bit fluid, right? And so very often the best answer is obviously the ability to share those resources, to have broad estimates of what they are, and obviously you can create legal chains in a way. You can, for instance, say that certain fisheries in these regions, we know that they move, and so the whole region is part of the economic zone that is shared much more easily than if you fight over where the boundary line is, and then which also has a huge economic cost. So you see that these three categories, I want to go a little bit more in the details of how the court addresses them, but you see the three categories are actually quite distinct. And there is, in my mind, an underlying lesson behind all of the three categories, but also what we learn from looking at all of those cases about the ability that the international system has to resolve these issues. And I'm going to go in the detail of this now. When we look at the International Court of Justice decisions, we look at the history of their decisions, it's really interesting to discover that obviously treaties have a huge impact. Why? Because it's a court. And so the basic working document of an adjudicator, a judge, is to make reference to pre-existing rule of law. It serves colonial times in a way unfairly to more recent times, especially when you have so much self-determination and new states that have appeared. But that's the background, right? That's the backlog, is that you look back at pre-existing treaties. There are other ways that states have, in a way, tried to make their cases, and I say it specifically. The court looks at treaties, but there are other ways that states have tried to make their case. They've used geography, they've used economy, they've used culture, for instance, references to language being spoken or trade relations, or special forms of exploitation of the land, like agriculture and so on, or it goes sometimes as far as using symmetries as reference of burial grounds, right? To make reference to go a bit further in culture. And then there also is some things that are recognized, or history, and I think when you look at these different categories, history, geography, economy, culture, sometimes elitism or ideology, you have a sense that this is much more cultural and it's less legalistic and it's more difficult maybe to even make the case. But these have been used by states and are still used to this day. If you look at the arguments, for instance, on the 9th dash line made by China over the South China Sea, you realize that they are not really concerned by treaties, they're much more concerned by culture. And if you look at the court recommendation and decision, I think it's now 3 years old, and I've read the court decision, it's quite interesting because the court basically says we can't look at culture, it's way too broad, but we have to look at what we have, and you've gone way too far. In the slide here, I talk about effective control, ut possidetis, and I think it's really interesting here as well because the court has sometimes made references to effective control and ut possidetis, which is basically the ability, the authority the state has to man and be present or to man and have delineated the border. Now, some of you may have read the work of Michel Fouché, and you would know that in Africa, for instance, which is the largest continent in the world, most boundary lines are not marked. We have almost, 30,000 or 28,000 kilometers of boundary line that are not marked in Africa. We kind of have treaties, so we have sense of where they are. But no states have actually made the effort to actually go and ride along the boundary line to put, markers and make sure that it was well identified. So it's not just in Latin America or in other places of the world that these things are not done. Even though we have treaties, we don't always have these treaties really well represented on the ground. Now, when we look at court decisions, and that's a little bit different, right? It's not the arguments presented to the court, but it's court decisions. It's very interesting to look at the way the court organizes its arguments. And that's the point I'm making here. The number one reference for the court is always pre-existing treaties, which obviously will benefit pre-existing members of the international communities that were the signatories of those treaties, above and beyond post-decolonization states. Second, the iuti posseditis, right? It's the idea of pre-existing consent and effective control. In other words, the ability to control the land that is supposedly yours. And then the court uses and tend to impose the intra legem principle, which is, I'm going to find what I think is fair. I'm going to find the position of what I think is fair. And what I think is really interesting is that the court likes the idea that, the fairest position for the boundary line is never the position that either states would want. In other words, the fairest position is always a position of the boundary line that may be fair in the number of square kilometers at sea or even at land. It could be, much more specific and not even involve. And it has worked in some cases extremely well, including as a principle, the intra legem has worked extremely well between China and Russia in very odd manners. It's well documented by Akihiro Iwashita in the book that he's written on the topic, where basically Russian officials and Chinese officials said, we just use intra legem and we draw lines. So if you had a disputed land that was, let's say, 24,000 kilometers, right? 24,000 miles square, we need 12,000 miles square each. We just draw a line that way. If there is a mountain in the middle, or if there is a river, why not just follow the river and then cut across the seam of the mountain, whatever. But they agreed that intra legem was actually a pretty neat principle. In the case that I talked about between Bolivia, Chile, and Peru, it's been a disaster at sea. There were riots across some of the countries when the court made its recommendations. So it doesn't always work well. So from the International Court of Justice, pre-existing treaties, iuti posseditis, and effective control are basically the three overwhelming, by order of importance, principle that the court has used to basically arbitrate disputes. And all of the court justifies these by wanting to implement stability and predictability. In other words, it limits the number of principles it uses because it limits it narrows the predictability or the unpredictability of their recommendations. It's quite interesting to see this, that the reasons why they limit basically the consistency of their decisions is because they want to maintain a form of territorial stability across the world. They are trying to prevent the system from fragmenting too fast, and they want to make sure that the system, the legal system, is predictable, hence their reference to pre-existing treaties. So the legal rationale here, and I'm sure Benjamin will have some comments on this, but I think it's quite interesting because it really is concerned by predictability and stability. And for me, this is kind of interesting, but it's also it also has some major problems, and I'm getting into them now. The International Court implements also de facto the Cairo Agreement 1964, and I say de facto because when you use pre-existing treaties, for instance, in the case of Africa, the Cairo Agreement basically has an article which basically says that decolonized states have to respect existing borders once independent. In other words, whatever decolonized states, and it's one of the major arguments that has been pushed by somebody like Michel Fouché as well, where he says that 50 years post 1964, the states are mature enough to understand the rationale behind the post-colonial border, or the position of the post-colonial boundary line. But we all know, historically, and that's kind of my critique on this, is that we all know that for European states, the establishment of boundary lines has been a reason to justify war for almost 120 years, in the 1800s and the 1900s. And that the adjustment of the boundary line across European states has been extremely lethal, right? I mean, 70 million people died in those two wars. So 50 years, and I don't know if that's good, and I think that's something that obviously we should think about more critically about this. So this is why I say this is a challenge for new political community, despite the agreement the agreement 50th birthday, because in 2014 is 50 years since the Cairo Agreement, but the International Court of Justice still imposes this. Now, another thing that I think is really interesting, it's much more critical of the court's decisions, is that when you look across all of the court decisions, one of the things that has been identified in the literature quite clearly is that the value of territory is a major correlate extremely well with the ability to resolve a dispute. So in territories that have high economic values, disputes are almost in two-thirds of the disputes are almost, in two-thirds of the cases, the disputes are resolved. And see, this is interesting because in most of these cases, if you look behind the case of the why 62% of those cases are resolved, it's because they are functional or positional disputes that have to do with very expensive or very valued land. So if you have oil or gas or coal, or if you have extremely wealthy fisheries, whatever, precious metals and so on and so forth, very often there is tremendous market pressure on the states as well as on the court to resolve the issues. And so treaties function quite well in these cases. And we see it in the statistics, basically these cases, these disputes are resolved. But in areas where the disputes are ethnic or they have to do with strategic territories, but the land has very little value, like religious value or linguistic value or political community-based value or identity value, well, the international community is unable to actually really resolve those. In the case of Yugoslavia, and it's not an accusation, but in the case of Yugoslavia, for instance, which is one of the most recent one, the Badinter commission that was in charge of the new boundaries between the old members of Yugoslavia gave up early on very specific delineation of certain valleys that had been submitted to pogrom during the war. And I don't want to go into detail, but it's a very important realization that these, ethnic, basically, disputes, these are basically left out of the international system, and we, to this day, are unable to resolve them. Statistically, we know that they are unresolved, and I cite some of the literature on this. There are some more recent ones. The Woodwell 2004 paper is the one that I think is the most interesting, because it kind of comes up with all of this statistic.
Sorry, can you go back to that? When I read that, I was thinking, for example, the DRC, Congo, I would argue that the territory has very high economic value because of the resources. So, in that case...
Why is it that they can't resolve it? You know, we have to go in the case specifically.
Okay.
This is based on, I think it's based on the analysis of court decisions that were, so from the, if I remember well, I have it written somewhere. I have it written obviously because all of this is done from the introduction to the Encyclopedia and more. I think it's based on at least 47 cases or 54, right? Basically looking at okay, what category of case do we have, and basically, and these represent basically the last, you know, all the decisions by the court concerning border disputes since the court was at work, right? So it's the last 35 years or 40 years.
I guess I was thinking that
but
how mutually exclusive these are, because it's also strategic territory, right? So there's a bit of a blurring between those two categorizations or criteria for territory.
Yeah, although it's interesting that, you know, even 62% of the cases for some people would not be so high, actually. If really market forces were so powerful, maybe it would be at 85 or 95. That's kind of the point I'm trying to make here. Even though, yes, I do admit that I'm polarizing, and I use the literature as a way to kind of identify something, because I think it tells us something about the ability the international system has. Now, this has been published, and I had it read by a high court judge. I won't say his name, but a high court judge, you know, who works in the court, and he sent me some very, very nice comments, and he even identified I had made a mistake on one of the court decisions. I misunderstood the test of one of the court decisions. But he said to me at the end, he said, I think you're a little bit critical of our work, and it pains me. But I think I had asked him to, you know, vet basically this polarization, because it's an attack on the court itself.
And just clarification from the web, the Golan Heights would fit into the second category. They'd be strategic.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I think so. So in my mind, it's interesting to see that, you know, the legal understanding of the questions that we have, basically the international system that we have enforces stability and predictability through territories and effective control, and I list it here. And the value of territory is central to disputes resolved. But it is interesting also to be reminded, right, that self-determination is not one of these driving principles that a lot of, I think, you know, democratically minded people would want to see actually, in a way, operationalized through policies by the international system. It actually is not actually present in the decisions. And it's quite interesting for me, because it shows that the system we have in place, in a way, values territory, or the value of territories, and serve markets' interests better than it serves, for instance, strategical or ethnic situations. So political, ethnic, territorial border disputes are very difficult, and the system is ill-equipped to resolve them. Now, maybe it's a bit harsh a conclusion to say that it's ill-equipped to resolve them, but we have evidence that the system we have in place today doesn't really resolve these situations very well. We don't know how to do this very well. And I mean, this is just to go back to the theorization. I have published this work in 2005, but I think it's kind of interesting, because what we see here is basically, 4 different ways to understand what is going on in the borderland. You have the role of multiple levels of governments, you have the local political clout, you have the culture, and then actually what the court does is really allows market forces and trade flows to regulate very effectively disputes in regions where market forces and trade flows are really important. Whereas the three other categories are kind of dismissed, right? Because we don't have the tools to address them, to allow for, the local cross-border political clouds would lead to, let's say, self-determination issues. No, we don't have the tools today to actually address this and resolve them well. And the broader conclusion is that thanks to the International Court of Justice, obviously governments are able to dominate the overarching infrastructure of the system, right? Governments are the key players there. They're actually the members of the international communities. But they are not, as members of the international communities, it's quite interesting to see that in the end, it's the value and market forces that influence the resolution of disputes. It's as if governments were basically there and had set up a system that don't really serve their disputes, but allows their market forces to resolve disputes that they may have with some fraction of their territories. In other words, you can question, how states look at this. And I'm really, to this day, I'm still kind of flabbergasted that governments wouldn't have in place system that would allow them to resolve once and for all some very difficult political disputes, like, the Golan Heights or, even other disputes that we see across the world. The system really allows for flows of goods and investments to span the borderlands, but when it comes to people, it's a completely different discussion.